All right, guys, welcome back to the last run-up of the years heading towards Civil War. Today we're going to be looking at Chapter 31, Bloody Kansas, okay? And this should go pretty short, pretty quickly, so make sure to take some notes here. We'll be kind of moving through this on a rapid pace. Main question, how does Kansas serve as a prelude to the conflict of the Civil War? I know it might sound weird to consider Kansas as like a battleground state, especially now because Kansas is just a place where, there are nice people and the Royals play there and it's mostly flat and boring to drive through, right? But Kansas back in the 1850s was an absolute, blood and gore fest, and mainly because they could not decide for themselves over the issue of slavery. So, your book even goes on to make the point that it's actually a civil war before the Civil War. So we're going to explore that and see what's going on. Start you out here with a picture of John Brown. He looks kind of like a psycho in this picture, of course, but we're going to explore, if he was actually a patriot and a freedom fighter or if he was a terrorist. Okay, this picture, of course, makes him look very extreme with a gun in one hand and the Bible in the other, trampling on men there on the ground while tornadoes and fire go in the background. So this is from John Stewart Curry, and this is John Brown at Harper's Ferry. Although it looks like it's Kansas in the background, so I'm not sure. Harper's Ferry is actually in a mountainous area, so we'll have to consider that. Now, real quick. Okay, true or false question. Were territories organized into free or slave states, or sorry, free or slave areas before they ever become states? And that's true. Territories did settle on the issue of slavery usually well before they applied for statehood. In fact, if you remember, the federal government sometimes just decided for them. And this was true in states like Ohio or Illinois or Indiana, all the Northwest Territory. They go ahead and decide. But Kansas, of course, will kind of be a battleground state because they are going to be the first state to employ this strategy of popular sovereignty. And according to the Kansas-Nebraska Act, this is the first time we'll get to see if democracy can really work. And it turns out it doesn't work very well at all. Southerners are initially not very inclined to open up Nebraska to settlement. They didn't want to see another state above the 3630 line go to slavery. Remember, the Missouri Compromise makes it so any state above 3630 will not have slavery. But Stephen Douglas from Illinois puts the Kansas-Nebraska Act through Congress and basically says this new southern state, Kansas, will get to decide if they want slavery or not. Kansas's soil is similar to Missouri's in that it can grow cotton, whereas Nebraska above it is much poorer in quality and cannot grow cotton. So Kansas will be the first time we get to actually see if popular sovereignty will work. It splits the Whig Party into two factions, which we mentioned before, whether or not to support the Kansas-Nebraska Act. The Southern Whigs are going to go to the Democratic Party. Sorry, that is wrong. And you got a note. They go to the Democratic Party, and the Northern Whigs will form the Republican Party under Abraham Lincoln. Okay, the North is really upset with this act because it basically means that the Missouri Compromise will be completely ignored. Okay, and therefore other areas above 3630 might be able to become states that have slavery. All right, and really where they get kind of an area to strike back at the South is not to enforce the fugitive slave law, which of course was supposed to be the biggest win for the South in the Compromise of 1850. Okay, so let's look at the actual fight. Well, what happens here is that there is a flood of settlers into Kansas, okay, and they're there to vote on the issue of slavery, okay, when it's organized as a state. Now, they are not Kansas citizens. They are literally citizens of Missouri, and I love this little cartoon here, right? They're dropping off from Missouri into Kansas. These guys are known as border ruffians, okay? And, they really are a pretty crass group of people who are hell-bent on making sure slavery sticks inside of Kansas. They're led by David Atchison. He is a senator in Kansas, senator in Missouri. That's once again wrong. Look at these errors in your guided notes. Missouri, who is leading 1,700 border ruffians, like we mentioned before, into Missouri. Okay, and these, of course, these people will threaten violence, as their name suggests. They are border ruffians, not border nice people, and they threaten violence to any who oppose slavery, which will be the people known as free soilers. Okay, The election will be more or less swung by these Missouri transplants, and slavery will be approved by a count of 36 to 30. 5,000 men will come over to Missouri to cast a legal vote. So Kansas, by popular sovereignty, will be elected as a slave state, although not the 90% figure that, of course, is, or actually over 90% figure that shows the actual vote. The first state legislature passes really harsh slave codes for those who, support slavery. It's illegal to speak out against slavery, and there was actually the death penalty that would be handed out to anyone who would help a slave escape or plan a revolt. So John Brown, of course, would receive the death penalty just by planning it. They also legalized the border vote. So they said it was fine that all of these Missourians came in to vote for slavery way back in the mid-1850s. So that's a convenient legislative trick to play to say, oh yeah, maybe it was illegal back then, but we're going to make it legal now for back then. That's kind of a way to detour the law. The Free Soilers who are in Kansas are, of course, not inclined to support slavery. If you remember, we looked at a political cartoon of a Free Soiler getting slavery jammed down his throat. Of course, Stephen Douglas is one of these people that was jamming it down. And so they set their own separate government, and they'll base it in Topeka, Kansas. They write their own constitution. They have their own governor. And so basically we get a state within a state, right? The official state, I guess, is the pro-slavery state led by the Border Ruffians, but we have a whole splinter state led by the Free Soilers. Now, from there, the center of anti-slavery government will kind of swing towards Lawrence, Kansas. I'll get a map out here real quick. Lawrence, Kansas. You can see where it's in relation. These are going to be, of course, in eastern Kansas. There it is, home to the University of Kansas now. Whoop, too far out. So you can see eastern Kansas, if you ever traveled on Interstate 70, Kansas City, Lawrence, and then just the west of that is Topeka, and then it's boring drive the rest of the way. Anyway, so Topeka will be kind of the second capital here, and it's going to be named after an abolitionist New England financier from Massachusetts. And basically, Lawrence, Kansas is going to be set up to be kind of a thorn in the side of the pro-slavery government. Now, what's going to happen is there's going to be a judge, a Kansas judge known as Samuel Lecomte, and he decides that the Free Soil government in Lawrence is treasonous and they should be indicted. And basically a posse of 800 men will go into Lawrence, all right, and they avoid violence. They don't actually fight, but the pro-slavery faction destroys much of the town. I think they threw their printing press into the river. And the sack of Lawrence basically puts the Free Soilers, I guess, in their place, right? And sends a signal, hey, you cannot do this. You cannot basically set up your own separate government. And the federal government doesn't step in. Franklin Pierce, who's president at the time, does absolutely nothing to make sure that conflict is avoided. Republicans do try to bring in Kansas as free, and Democrats try to bring it in as slave. So regardless of what the vote says, both sides know that something is off, and they both try and halt, the admission of the other side's statehood, okay? Enter John Brown. John Brown, of course, is going to be a religious fanatic who views the sack of Lawrence as a violation of the rights of freedom fighters. He is kind of a religious fanatic, the devout man of the Bible, and basically he views it as completely normal to eradicate those who support slavery by violent means, if necessary. He is so pissed off by Lawrence, and he decides he wants to strike terror in the hearts of pro-slavery people. That's a quote from your textbook. So what happens at Pottawatomie Creek, John Brown and 7 others raid the homes of those who supported slavery. They hack at their heads with broadswords, and they kill close to 5 people. This is, terrorism in exercise, but yet John Brown is fighting for the eradication of slavery, and he views violence as completely appropriate. The abolitionist response is to more or less revere him as a cult hero. They let him escape, and he is basically free to move about the North, despite the fact that he's murdered people because his cause is seen as just. Over the next few years, bloody civil war erupts in Kansas and 200 Kansasonians. I wonder what that name is. Huh. Anyway, look up someone from Kansas. Wonder what they're called. Anyway, 200 lose their lives, and this is basically going to end up being a prelude to the Civil War. All right, we're going to switch gears real quick and talk about an episode that happened in Congress in Washington, D.C. in 1856. And this is the caning of Charles Sumner. And this is truly mind-boggling that this sort of thing would go down in the highest, law of the land, the place where the supposedly the most refined gentlemen gather to talk about policy. But every once in a while, I guess our leaders kind of break down into their more base forms. But what happened with this episode is that Charles Sumner, who's a senator from Massachusetts, an abolitionist, gives a speech known as The Crime Against Kansas, in which he criticizes the actions of Missourians, calling them murderous robberings and hirelings. Basically, he says they're crass humans and they, are deserving of any sort of violence and punishment that comes to them. He attacks particularly South Carolina Senator Andrew Butler and Preston Brooks, who is actually a relative of Butler's and a representative from the South Carolina House, says that Sumner goes too far. A couple days after the end of his speech, he comes into Congress declaring how Sumner had insulted his distant cousin Butler, and Brooks beats Sumner repeatedly over the head with a gold-tipped cane until it breaks and he had to be restrained. So literally, we have a man beat up while the rest of the senators and congressmen look on in shock. And it actually does quite a bit of damage to Charles Sumner. It takes many years for him to actually heal from this. Like, it actually creates physical trauma for Charles Sumner, and he never really truly survives. In fact, his seat in the Senate is left vacant in the years after the caning because he literally can't sit there, and it's kind of this reminder of the brutality of the South. The North's response, as you can imagine, is shock. They can't believe that the South could produce a human being that could beat someone mercilessly in what is supposed to be a civilized area of disagreement. Brooks is punished only by a $300 fine, and he is actually revoted into his Senate. Sorry, he's not a senator. He's from the House. He's revoted into his seat as a representative. So, nothing is really done to punish him, and Southerners regard him as a hero. They actually send him replacement canes for the one that he broke. And this is further going to outrage Northerners who view, the South resistance as shockingly violent. All right, that'll be the end of chapter 31. Feel free to ask me any questions if you have some, if you want to dig more into John Brown or this canning affair. It's pretty interesting stuff.